My name is Jim Coffield. I'm a psychologist. I'm a pastor. For 20 years, I was the clinical director of the Reformed Theological Seminary, their counseling program. So I've been training counselors or doing counseling for the better part of 35 years. And I've had, compared to some people in the world, a really easy life that God's been really gracious to, but I've also tasted and walked in struggle and suffering. In my world of counseling, I found that people who pretend and don't live in the truth tend to not get better. And when I do that, I tend to not get better. And when I have the courage to be honest with my wife or my friends or with God, I tend to grow, even in the hard things. And I'm not sure anybody's qualified when it comes to understanding sorrow and struggle. I think sometimes in America we've got so much that sometimes what we call suffering, the rest of the world might kind of smile at and say, I'm not sure that's really suffering. I do think that I've got a little bit fed up with, both in the psychological world and the Christian world, kind of a pretending that life is easy and pretending that life is simplistic, and found that in my own life, though I'm kind of learning it the hard way right now with the death of my son, in my own life I found that I got healthier not when I avoided pain or avoided truth, but actually went through it or kind of stepped into it. And that's an odd thing to do, both theologically and psychologically in our culture, is to step toward pain. Now, the percentage of people who avoid difficult things and their strategy to avoid ends up becoming worse than if they'd faced it is probably in the high 90s. We know from medical research that 30% of people do not go back to doctors in fear of bad news. And that means somebody who knows they have a bad heart, knows they need to return. 30% of them don't go back. So it's even more so in the areas of spiritual and psychological issues that we don't have as much control over. If you spend your life in avoidance, first of all, it will take most of your energy. You'll be exhausted. Second, if you live in avoidance, you won't live with a confidence, and you'll always be afraid of being caught or being an imposter. And you'll always live with that sense of dread. And you'll sometimes live with a sense of inevitability, like the tide is going to come in and eventually it all just blows up, because we know there's things that we've got to face. And so the person who lives in avoidance will ultimately be disappointed with God, disappointed with themselves, and be self-protective in relationships. Our ability to dissociate says something about the way that God created us. So there's children who are abused, they dissociate because there's not a category in their brain to deal with abuse or the kind of trauma they deal with. And you've all had that happen. There's been a car accident or a funeral and it feels like you're almost not there. That's dissociation, and that's an ability that's been put in the brain, but it's not an ability that's supposed to be a ongoing coping strategy. It's an ability that helps you survive through until you're ready to deal with it more directly. I think in the Christian world, we have a whole slew of things we do instead of really dealing with the truth. And it's interesting, Jesus says he's the truth, and he also said truth sets you free, and we often avoid it. Overworking, because we value productivity so much in both our Christian culture and in American society, overworking is a way to deal with emotional pain. Religious busyness, getting involved in serving the church, and it's should we serve the church? Of course, but we all know times, and I've done it at times, where I've gotten involved in things to keep from dealing with the hard things. I know some missionaries who went to the mission field basically because they didn't want to deal with some deep things that they probably should have dealt with before they went to the mission field. People pleasing, because niceness is such an important part of the Christian culture. People pleasing is seeking approval. Always it can mask insecurity, shame, or pain, or sorrow. Perfectionism. People that are perfectionists tend to not be very happy because in a fallen world, there's something wrong with everything. Perfection is impossible. However, the striving for perfectionism puts you in control, and when you're in control, you don't feel as vulnerable. Sometimes we over-intellectualize. I know some people after Skylar passed away, they didn't know what to do with the sorrow of it, and so they just made a theological or intellectual truth. And even though it was true, it wasn't very helpful. But we tend to do that. Over spiritualization, sometimes I call that a spiritual bypass. When somebody there's a problem going on, and they just, instead of saying this is hard, they go, well, I guess God wanted another flower in his garden, and that's not helpful to anybody, except it just bypasses that this is a hard conversation. Sometimes we use humor and sarcasm. That's something I use a lot when I'm to try to avoid that. And all those things are somewhat socially acceptable, both in the Christian world and in the secular world. Nobody wants to step into sorrow. Nobody wants to step into struggle. There are things that can be avoided. I mean, if you're walking in the woods and there's a bear, it's not wise to face that bear. It's not wise to walk toward that bear. It's wise to avoid that bear. And so pain for the sake of pain has no glory in it. Our nervous system is set up to be slightly anxious so it would protect us. And so there is a healthy type of avoidance that anticipates difficult things and doesn't anticipates that the stove is hot, so I don't put my hand on it. And that's healthy avoidance. It's when there's something that is truly sad that we don't, or it's truly disappointing, or truly catastrophic, that if we don't deal with that, then that's a negative use of that avoidance part. Why do we not deal with our struggles and the sorrows and the suffering of this world directly? I think we have a fear of vulnerability. We don't want to admit pain because it feels like weakness. So there's a fear of vulnerability. It goes against our desire for control. We want to control everything, because if we control everything, we're not as anxious. And if I'm going to step into something I can't control, I'm going to be anxious. I don't want to deal with that. So that fear of vulnerability, desire for control. I think there's even a misunderstanding of God. We sometimes believe that God only blesses, and that if you're doing everything right, you only get blessings, as opposed to that there's going to be difficult things that God will be with you in. I mean, He doesn't promise us an easy life. He promises that we will not be alone. I will be with you always, even to the ends of the earth. The ends of the earth doesn't sound like a real positive place to go. But the promise is not that you don't have to go to the ends of the earth. The promise is that you won't go there alone in the Christian faith. But we've kind of cheapened the gospel into, hey, if you're with Jesus, then everything's going to be easy.